A man sat slumped by his daughter Lily's crib at 3 a.m., exhaustion shaking his hand. The cruel truth was visible on his phone. Only $6 remained. Desperate, he typed a plea intended for an old friend. "I'm sorry, I know this is your old number, but if you could lend me $30, my baby is completely out of formula." He hit send. 2 minutes later, his phone buzzed violently. The glacial reply arrived. "Who is this? Why am I receiving texts like this during a takeover meeting?" The stark signature appeared. Clara Voss, CEO, Voss Holdings. He was paralyzed by dread. Ethan Ward, 35, lived in a constant, grinding state of operational deficit. He wasn't just tired, he was chronically depleted, his body running on fumes and the pure, desperate love he held for his 8-month-old daughter, Lily. Lily was everything. She was the final, precious gift from his late wife, Sarah, who had passed away tragically from complications shortly after Lily's birth. Ethan carried Sarah's memory and Lily through his triple-shift life as a delivery worker. His routine was brutal. A 4 a.m. shift sorting packages, a quick run home for coffee and a diaper change, a midday shift driving the courier van, and a late-night shift working warehouse sanitation, all while Lily was either with a subsidized, rotating sitter or, on the worst nights, sleeping fitfully in a cheap bassinet tucked into the corner of the staff break room. He lived on cold, instant noodles and whatever tepid leftover coffee he could afford. He was a single father surviving, not living. That night, the system failed. The final essential component, Lily's specialized, expensive formula, was gone. Ethan stood in the kitchen, the empty container in his hands, staring at the label with a growing sense of cold, existential terror. This was not a bill. This was survival. He had meant to message Tom, a kind former colleague who was the only person he trusted enough to ask for a loan. But in his exhaustion, the numbers blurred. He hit send on a contact he had stored years ago for a brief, forgotten business interaction. The plea was delivered into the void. Miles away in her soundproofed, minimalist penthouse 40 stories above the city, Clara Voss, 30, was the epitome of controlled power. She was known as the Ice Queen of Manhattan, a financial prodigy who had multiplied her family's already vast fortune through calculated, emotionally detached investments. Her world was a fortress of glass and steel. She didn't believe in chance, and she certainly didn't believe in the honesty of strangers. When the text arrived, disrupting her midnight review of leveraged buyouts, her initial reaction was a cold, pure spike of rage. How dare they breach my privacy? Her mind immediately categorized it. A sophisticated phishing attempt, a social engineering trap, a manipulation tactic. Unacceptable, she muttered to her empty, vast living room, the city lights below twinkling like indifferent stars. She began to type a reply that was a model of corporate dismissal, intending to have her legal team trace the number immediately. Another lazy opportunist trying to leverage sympathy for quick cash. But then the attached photograph downloaded. She didn't have to open it fully to see the detail. A small, perfect infant's hand, its fingers curled around a man's calloused, worn thumb. The image was grainy, taken in poor lighting, yet it possessed an overwhelming, suffocating intimacy. No scammer would bother with such heartbreaking detail. No lie could convey that precise, tender vulnerability. Clara stopped. Her breath hitched, an involuntary response her finely tuned system hadn't anticipated. She slowly put her phone down, walked to the vast window, and stared out. The image was a direct, brutal contradiction to the corporate report she had read that morning, a report categorizing all poverty as a lack of effort. She returned to the phone, reading Ethan's text for a third, then a fourth time. "My baby is out of formula. This wasn't about the money. This was about a biological imperative." She felt an unfamiliar, uncomfortable pressure behind her eyes, the phantom of an old, deep pain stirring. She slammed the door on that feeling and reverted to logistics. Transaction. Solve the problem. She typed back, her fingers still stiff with control. "I still do not believe your sincerity, but send me the name and address of the nearest all-night pharmacy or store. Immediately." Ethan, already mortified, didn't see the text. He had deactivated his phone's data connection, unable to bear the weight of his desperate mistake. He was now pacing, cradling a crying Lily, trying to soothe her with tap water, a useless gesture that only amplified his despair. 10 minutes later, the sharp, unexpected knock echoed through the thin walls of his apartment. A delivery driver, wearing a premium service uniform Ethan couldn't afford to look at, handed him a massive, industrial-size, sealed bag of Lily's exact, specific formula. The size alone suggested weeks of supply. The driver also gave him an envelope. Inside, on heavy, Voss Holdings corporate stationery, was a short, uncompromising note written in a severe, elegant script. This is not a loan, it is a transaction of necessity. Do not let that baby starve. No contact is required or desired after this. CEO. Ethan was beyond tears. He simply slumped against the doorframe, gripping the bag as if it were a life raft. He hadn't asked for charity, but he had received salvation. He looked at Lily, now quiet and drowsy from the sheer presence of the formula, and then back at the note. He had to respond. He had to attach a real person to this act of impossible corporate grace. He reactivated his phone and sent a final, heartfelt text. Thank you. I will pay you back, line by line, when I have the money. I promise, I will not let this be an act of charity. I will honor this debt. Clara, now back in her power structure, saw the message. The sheer, honest desperation in the word debt resonated with her own meticulous code of honor. But she didn't reply. She minimized the chat, deleted the photographic evidence from her cache, and forced herself back into the cold, calculated world of high finance, hoping the warm, unsettling feeling of human connection would simply fade. Ethan's old colleague Tom, who eventually heard the full, incredible story, later recalled, he kept the CEO's note folded up, not as a debt reminder, but as a reminder that the world had sent him a guardian angel with a corporate jet. He was scared of the debt, but he was more scared of losing the hope it represented. The debt of gratitude weighed heavier on Ethan than any monetary debt. He felt compelled to acknowledge the gesture, to put a face to the thank you. The next morning, skipping his early shift to ensure Lily was fed and safe, he drove to the 24-hour store mentioned in the delivery receipt, determined to leave a tangible gift for the mysterious CEO. He could only afford a six-pack of imported mineral water and a handwritten card. The clerk, a bored, middle-aged woman, looked blankly at the corporate receipt Ethan showed her. Voss Holdings, she repeated, adjusting her glasses. Sir, this was paid through a level 4 corporate expenditure account. This wasn't a person. This was a company transaction. We can't accept gifts for the company, and we certainly don't have a contact for a CEO, let alone a forwarding service for mineral water. Ethan felt the full weight of the wall between their two worlds. The anonymity was intentional, a defense mechanism. He realized she didn't want thanks. She wanted distance. He sent a final frustrated text to the number. I understand you don't want contact, but please know that you saved us. I wish I could say thank you properly. Silence. An hour later, he deleted the conversation again, resolved to simply work harder and never contact the number again. Clara, at that moment, was at the Global Economic Summit in Chicago, delivering a keynote speech on the necessity of fiscal discipline in philanthropic investment. The atmosphere was chilly. The audience comprised of investors who viewed charity as a necessary tax write-off, not a moral obligation. During a panel discussion on wealth distribution, a fellow panelist, a prominent conservative economist, delivered a scathing commentary on state assistance. The data is irrefutable. Unconditional charity fosters dependence. We must stop enabling the structural laziness of the underclass. They simply ask, they never produce. The words ask, never produce hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. She thought of Ethan's rough, callous thumb next to his baby's perfect hand. He wasn't lazy, he was drowning. The image of the single father, alone in his apartment with a $6 balance, was the visual antithesis of the economist's theory. In a rare moment of public deviation, Clara took the microphone. With respect, she said, her voice commanding the silence, I believe we often confuse desperation with idleness. Our investment portfolios are not the only things that require grounding in reality. True corporate social responsibility begins when we acknowledge that sometimes people simply need immediate, no-strings intervention, not a multi-year dependency plan. They need a life raft, not a lecture. The audience was shocked. This was an unprecedented display of sentiment from the Ice Queen. Later that afternoon, she quietly instructed her assistant to change the scope of the original donation. Double the formula donation and establish a dedicated emergency fund, discretionary, no questions asked, to cover immediate needs for single-parent families in the tri-state area. Name it the Bridge Fund, and do not, under any circumstances, leak this to the press. While Clara was wrestling with her conscience in a five-star ballroom, Ethan was facing his final professional humiliation. His manager, a man whose tie was perpetually too tight, had called him into the small, fluorescent-lit office. "Ward, this is the third time this month you've called in late due to an infant emergency," the manager stated, pushing termination papers across the desk. "We run a logistics company, not a daycare. The clients demand reliability. We need personnel whose minds aren't preoccupied with a crying infant at home. It's a liability we can no longer carry." Ethan looked at the papers, the stark, black ink confirming his worst fear. He felt no anger, only a deep, immobilizing wave of defeat. He was invisible. His immense effort, 3 jobs, endless sleepless nights, was deemed simply a liability. He signed the papers silently, collected his sparse belongings, a picture of Sarah, a worn baseball cap, and walked out into the harsh afternoon sun, another casualty of the impossible work-life balance imposed on the poor. That night, alone, unemployed, and terrified, the unthinkable happened. Lily developed a sudden, terrifying, high-grade fever. Her small body was radiating heat, her breathing shallow, her cries weak and distant. Ethan tried everything: cool baths, children's fever reducer, but the temperature gauge kept climbing towards the danger zone. He couldn't afford a taxi, and the thought of waiting for an ambulance response time paralyzed him. In a fugue state of panic, his mind bypassed all logical contacts. He reached for the only number that had ever produced an impossible miracle. He knew he was violating her explicit instruction, but his child's life was worth the risk of her corporate wrath. He typed, his vision blurred with tears and adrenaline. "I violated your request. I apologize. But my daughter is burning up with fever. I have no money, and I have absolutely no one left on this earth to ask. I need help, not a loan. Please, I need help." 30 minutes later, a lifetime of terror, a professional, unmarked medical van pulled up to his building. A nurse, impeccable and calm in a private uniform, knocked. "Mr. Ward, I am Nurse Thompson. I'm from a private service. My employer's name is Clara Voss. I was instructed to provide immediate, intensive stabilization for your daughter." The nurse worked with serene, focused efficiency. She ran the IV, monitored the vital signs, and brought the fever down with professional speed. Lily was saved, pulled back from the brink of a terrifying, rapid infection. Ethan sat on the floor, holding Lily's hand, watching the rhythmic drip of the IV bag. His voice was a raw croak when he finally picked up his phone. He sent the text that contained the whole, terrible truth of his life. "You saved her life. Not just the milk, but her life. I am unemployed. I am completely broken. I owe you every breath she takes." This time Clara was waiting. She replied immediately, her text terse, firm, and yet carrying an undeniable core of purpose. "Pay me back, Ethan. Pay me back by being the father she needs you to be. That is the only acceptable return on my investment." Nurse Thompson recounting the experience to her supervisor. "The man was utterly spent. He didn't ask me who she was or why she did it. He just kept repeating, 'Thank you for saving my debt.'" He didn't see the nurse. He saw the kindness. He was a good father who just needed a window of opportunity. The debt of life gave Ethan a strange, renewed resolve. He refused to sit still. 1 month later, having secured temporary emergency funds through community services, he applied for a security position he had seen advertised online. It was a minimal, non-corporate role, night guard duty, for the tenant association of the immense high-end office tower in Midtown. He needed the steady hourly wage. He was assigned to a specialized route, the executive floors. He learned only on his second night that the building's highest tenant, occupying floors 50 through 55, was Voss Holdings. He still didn't make the connection. He was just a nameless guard patrolling a corporate landscape. On his first morning shift, he was stationed at the main 52nd floor executive elevator, waiting for the cleaning crew to arrive. The metallic chime of the elevator bell echoed in the pristine, marble-lined lobby. The door hissed open, and the air immediately changed. Clara Voss stepped out. She was dressed in an impossibly chic, pale gray suit, every line of it perfect, her jewelry subtle, lethal, and expensive. She carried herself with the cold, absolute authority of a sovereign. Ethan, standing rigidly in his ill-fitting polyester guard uniform, was the exact definition of contrast. The only things they shared were the deep exhaustion etched beneath their eyes and the secret shared history of two techs. They stared at each other across the polished expanse of the lobby. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure, bending the light around them. Clara was the first to speak, her voice low, a controlled tremor beneath the authority. "The guard uniform. I should have known you would land near me eventually." Ethan didn't flinch. He simply held her gaze, a man who had nothing left to lose. "The elevator lobby. I should have guessed that the person who saved my child lived at the top of the world." "You are the one who sent the text?" she repeated, her voice a near whisper. "And you," Ethan countered, a slight, humorless smile touching his lips, "are the one who chose to save a beggar instead of ignoring him." Clara waved off her oncoming assistant in security detail, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, assessing him not as an employee, but as a crucial variable in her own life. "Ethan," she said, finally using his name again, giving it weight. "I apologize for the anonymity. It was a reflex, a professional reflex of self-preservation. Come into my office, now." Twist 1. The shared wound and confession. In her cavernous office, Clara looked out over the vast, glittering expanse of Manhattan. She didn't offer him a seat. She needed him to stand, to be present for the weight of her secret. "I told myself I didn't want thanks," she began, her back still to him. "But the truth is, I couldn't accept it. Because your text, your desperation, was a mirror to my own past failure. When your text arrived demanding only $30 for formula, it broke 5 years of absolute emotional lockdown." She turned, her eyes now dangerously bright, showing a depth of pain no public image had ever contained. "I lost my son, Lucas, 5 years ago. Complications immediately after birth. My husband blamed me, or maybe blamed the money, and he walked out while I was still in the recovery room. I buried the boy. I buried the grief, and I buried myself in this company. I vowed that I would never open myself to that kind of love, that kind of loss, again." A tear tracked a perfect line through her flawless makeup. "Your photo, Ethan, that tiny perfect hand, it was a ghost. It was the moment I realized that even if I couldn't save my son, I could damn well save yours." She looked at him, demanding understanding. "I didn't save Lily for you. I saved her for Lucas. I saved her to prove I still had a heart worth saving." Ethan stood silent, the rigid security posture finally dissolving. He was looking at a woman who, beneath the impenetrable armor of wealth, was just as broken as he was. "Maybe Lily was meant to be the message that reminded you there are two kinds of people, Clara," he said, his voice husky. "The kind who run away from the pain, and the kind who run toward the pain for a child." The very next day, the external crisis exploded. An investigative report, fueled by the disgruntled ex-partner, accused Clara Voss of orchestrating a mass layoff, using the savings to fund a cynical, small-scale charity facade, the Bridge Fund, purely for tax benefits. The headlines were brutal. "Voss cuts jobs to fund vanity charity." The mandatory emergency press conference was called. Clara stood at the podium, fielding the accusations, her face pale, the stress showing for the first time. The situation was spiraling. The media was convinced she was a hypocrite. Ethan, dressed in his uniform, was posted by the door. He watched the hostile crowd, the flashing bulbs, and saw the desperation in Clara's eyes. This wasn't just a corporate crisis. It was the annihilation of the only honest thing she had done in years. He made a split-second decision. He knew the security protocols, and he violated them all. He strode onto the platform, standing shoulder to shoulder with the CEO. The room erupted. "Who is that? Guard, get off the stage!" Ethan ignored them. He picked up a wireless microphone, his voice strong and steady, the voice of a man who had stared down poverty and death. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ethan Ward," he announced. "I was a delivery driver. I was recently unemployed. And a few weeks ago, I was completely broke, sitting in a dark apartment with a sick child and a $6 bank account balance." The noise died down. Every eye in the room was fixed on the odd pairing. Ethan then projected the visual evidence onto the massive screen behind them. The blurred CCTV footage of the late-night formula delivery, the time-stamped medical receipt from the private nurse, and his original, desperate text message. He deliberately omitted the name of the recipient in the final shot. The CEO of Voss Holdings, who you are currently crucifying for cynical charity, intervened in my life twice, Ethan stated, his voice ringing with absolute sincerity. "She sent a life-saving supply of formula and an emergency medical team for my daughter when I reached out by mistake. She did this anonymously, demanding only that I be a good father. This was not a tax write-off. This was not public relations. This was a private, secret, human act of grace. You are attacking a woman who saved my child's life with no expectation of ever seeing me again?" The room was silent. Then a single loud gasp cut through the air. The media narrative shattered. The story immediately inverted. CEO's secret kindness revealed by single father. Clara, who had kept her face hardened against the hostile questions, finally succumbed. The mask dissolved. She began to cry openly, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, not with corporate fear, but with human emotion, live on every major news outlet. She managed to speak into the microphone, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I only did what I wished someone had done for me. Compassion isn't a strategy, it's an investment in humanity." Ethan stood by her side, a security guard turned human shield. He didn't touch her, but he stood, a silent promise of solidarity. After the frenzy subsided, Clara met Ethan in her quiet office. "You saved my reputation, Ethan," she whispered, exhausted. "No, Clara, I simply paid the debt of honor. You taught me that even the most powerful people are human. I returned the favor." She smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I need that kind of heart in my company. I need someone who understands the true value of a rescue. If I offered you the title of Director of Humanitarian Strategy, reporting directly to me, would you accept the role?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I may not have the education, but I have the experience of being saved. I accept." 1 year later, the Baby Bridge Foundation was a national beacon of compassionate philanthropy. It was no longer a small, discreet fund. It was a full-scale integrated program providing free specialized infant formula, pediatric emergency response, and comprehensive childcare support for single parents nationwide. Ethan Ward, the wrong number dad, was its CEO of operations. The community loved him, a symbol of redemption and proof that empathy could exist at the highest levels of corporate power. His official title was just a formality. His true title, bestowed by the families they served, was the Bridge. He frequently spoke at local outreach events, often retelling the story of the $6 bank account and the wrong number. His closing line, always delivered with a wink, was, "Wrong number, right person. Trust the universe's logistics." Clara Voss's transformation was visible, tangible, and profound. Her professional detachment had been replaced by a grounded, practical engagement. She spent less time conducting hostile takeovers and more time in the community centers. Her glass fortress was now a functional office. She had moved her primary desk to the same floor as Baby Bridge. She often walked down the hall past Ethan's office, just to peek in on him, usually finding him covered in Lily's finger paint or fielding a logistics call about a shipment of specialized milk. Her moments of pure connection often occurred when she held Lily, now a rambunctious, curious 2-year-old. If you hadn't sent that desperate, mistaken text, Ethan, Clara admitted one quiet afternoon, her eyes glistening as she held the child she had saved, I would still be living inside a tomb of glass. I would still be a terrible person who believed human kindness was obsolete. You didn't just save Lily's life. You gave me my life back. Kyo. The symbol of their unexpected partnership was moved from the office lobby to a place of honor within the Baby Bridge headquarters. Ethan's old phone, the device that had initiated the chain of impossible events, was mounted in a display case. It was no longer just a relic. It was the Foundation's holy artifact. The plaque beneath the framed phone was simple and profound. One wrong text can change 2 lives. Never be afraid to ask for help, and never refuse the opportunity to give it. The phone was a constant, powerful reminder that vulnerability was not a weakness. It was, in fact, the most potent currency for change. 2 years into the life of the Baby Bridge Foundation, its reach extended across the nation. The model, corporate efficiency meeting radical compassion, was being adopted by other major corporations. Ethan Ward, the former minimum wage delivery driver, stood on the world stage, a keynote speaker at the World Philanthropic Summit in London. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but the calluses on his hands were still visible when he gripped the podium. My story is simple, Ethan began, addressing an audience of global leaders and CEOs. It began with $6 and a wrong number. The lesson is not about the power of billions, but the power of a micro-intervention. You don't need a 10-year plan to save a life. You just need a single, honest act of immediate kindness. Sometimes the thing you need most in the world isn't a grand strategy. It's just a text message sent to the right person, at the precise moment it matters most. Clara Voss sat in the audience, no longer the Ice Queen, but a fiercely proud co-founder. Her gaze was soft, filled with the undeniable warmth of a woman who had finally found her true purpose. When the summit concluded, she found Ethan backstage, amidst the crush of dignitaries eager to shake his hand. "You've changed the world, Ethan," she said, her voice quiet and deeply sincere. "We changed the world, Clara," he corrected her gently. "We are a team that started with 0 money and 0 hope, and now we have both." She leaned in, her eyes reflecting the genuine emotion he had helped unlock. "You know, that message didn't just save Lily's life. It saved mine. You gave me a reason to feel, a way to channel my grief into a powerful, positive force. I will be forever grateful for your mistake." Ethan simply took her hand, a gesture that had evolved from dependency to partnership, and finally to something deeper and more essential. We only needed each other for a single second. The moment that text went through, and that 1 second was enough to change a lifetime for both of us. The final, lasting image was of their shared life. Lily, now 3 years old, a joyful, unstoppable force of nature, ran up to them, shouting for a hug. The camera slowly zoomed out, capturing the 3 of them walking out of the gleaming glass headquarters of the Baby Bridge Foundation, bathed in the early morning sunlight. The glass reflected the bold, clear lettering above the door, a permanent promise to the world. Baby Bridge Foundation, kindness sent, message delivered, a life reclaimed. If you believe a single text can change a life when sent with kindness, share this story and subscribe. We tell true moments that remind the world that compassion always finds its way.